I'm going to go over my understanding of papal authority and the Roman Rite. So papal authority, especially in relation to the liturgy, but specifically what we're doing is talking about the Roman Rite. Now, what we're going to do is just go over just a couple preliminary remarks before we dive in. I want to address what kind of Catholic am I? Believe it or not, there have been some people, in fact, I noticed, in some of the comments before the show began, some were asking the question, why would you have this guy on your channel, on a traditional Catholic channel, as if I'm not a traditional Catholic? I want to make it clear that I'm a traditional Catholic. There have been people out there who have misrepresented my perspective without actually looking into the information that I've presented. So I just want to be very, very clear. I'm a traditional Catholic. In fact, I don't think that there's any other kind of Catholic that you could be. Liberal Catholics and things like that, those are people who are unfaithful to the magisterium. And so I think the only kind of Catholic that you could be is a traditional Catholic. Now, we're also going to talk a little bit about the liturgy of the Missal of 1969. And what do I mean by that? Well, what I don't mean when I'm referring to the Novus Ordo or the Missal of 1969 or the liturgy of Paul VI, whatever term you want to use, whatever phrase. What I don't mean is the liturgical abuses that are often experienced at an average parish. That is not what I'm referring to. I detest liturgical abuse. Let me reiterate that. I detest liturgical abuse. I don't like it. I have been very critical, not overly critical, right? Not nitpicking here and there, but been very critical when it was necessary to be critical of liturgical abuses in parishes that I've been at. In other words, actually, let me give you an example. I have witnessed the precious blood being spilled, and that boiled my blood. Now, I'm not judging intentions on part of anybody who spilled it, but that was a major problem that I witnessed. I went directly to the bishop and told him, look, according to the directives of the Vatican, you need to withhold the chalice until this issue is taken care of and people are presenting the chalice in a worthy way, in a way that is careful. You need to withhold the chalice and only give communion under one kind. That's per the directives of the Vatican in the post-conciliar church. I think as of 2004, if I'm not mistaken. And for that, my reward was to be banned from the chalice. In other words, to not receive communion for over 6 months. Not only because I spoke against that, but the priest also withheld communion from me because I was unwilling to receive from an extraordinary minister of Holy Communion and preferred to receive from an actual priest. So I detest liturgical abuses. I am traditional, and I have been outspoken and have even gone through unjust retaliation. That's just one example. I can go through others. So let me be clear. When I'm speaking about the Missal of Paul VI, I'm not saying that I'm in favor of liturgical abuses or any of the shenanigans that you might see going on in some parishes. That being said, I am open to reforming the view that I present here in this presentation. So if I could be shown to be wrong anywhere, I'm more than happy to change my mind. Wouldn't be the first time that I've done it. So, all right, so let's move in to the question. So the question is, can the Pope abolish the Latin Mass? Now, I'm going to rephrase this. I understand what's being meant by that, but I want to rephrase it. I want to be a little bit more precise with our terminology because I think there's just too many misunderstandings if we use those terms. I'm going to rephrase it to say the better way to phrase this is, can the Pope discontinue the Missal of 1962 and replace it with the Missal of 1969? Now, asking can he do this is not the same as asking should he. If we're going to ask the question, should he do this? We're going to have a very different presentation than what I'm about to demonstrate. But if the question is can, as far as power and authority of the papacy, I'm going to answer yes. So the short answer is going to be the magisterium affirms that the Pope can discontinue the Missal of 1962 and replace it with the Missal of 1969. But there's a big qualification here. Notice the note that I have there at the bottom. This is only possible because the Missal of 1969 is not a different rite than the Missal of 1962. So if a Pope were to discontinue the Missal of 1962, if a Pope were to do it, I'm not saying he should, but I'm just saying if he were to, and replace it with the Missal of 1969. He has not abolished one rite and replaced it with a different rite, because the Missal of 62 is the same rite as the Missal of 69. Again, and I'm talking about objectively. I'm not talking about liturgical abuses. I'm talking about the Missal itself, objectively considered and done and presented well. In fact, if you want an example of how it can be done very well, St. John Cantius Parish in Chicago does the extraordinary form and the ordinary form both very, very well. And I've been to liturgies of both of those and thought it was incredible. And I think that they're a great, great model for how the Novus Ordo should be celebrated. So when I speak of the Missal of 1969, I'm thinking St. John Cantius style, not Susan at the parish council style or anything like that. But again, could he do this? Yes, because the Missal of 69 is not a different rite than the Missal of 62. The Roman Rite would still be preserved in the Mass of Paul VI, in other words. All right, moving on. We're going to talk about the magisterium on papal authority and the liturgy. First up is the Council of Trent. It says this, quote, "It furthermore declares that this power has ever been in the church, that in the dispensation of these sacraments, their substance being untouched," I want you to notice that, "their substance must remain untouched. The church has no authority to change the substance of the sacraments." Zero. The Pope can't do it. An ecumenical council can't do it. Nobody can change the substance of a sacrament. That being said, it may ordain or change what things soever it may judge most expedient. And notice that it's the church judging what is most expedient, not me as a private individual, not me as a lay Catholic. The church, in whatsoever it judges most expedient, it may ordain or change for the profit of those who receive, or for the veneration of said sacraments, according to the difference of circumstances, times, and places. See, I lost my place there. And this, the apostle said not obscurely to have imitated when he says, "Let a man so account of us as the ministers of Christ and the dispensers of the mysteries of God." So they give a scriptural support for that position. All right, moving on to the next one here. The First Vatican Council, it states this, quote, "Wherefore we teach and declare that but by divine ordinance, the Roman Church possesses a preeminence of ordinary power over every other church, and that this jurisdictional power of the Roman pontiff is both episcopal and immediate." Now, here's the part. "Both clergy and faithful of whatever rite," notice this is not just for the Roman Rite, this is for the Eastern Catholics as well, "of whatever rite and dignity, both singly and collectively, are bound to submit to this power." Notice that there is an obligation to submit to this power by the duty of a hierarchical subordination and true obedience. And this not only in matters concerning faith and morals. So we're not just talking about matters of faith and morals where an obedience is to be given, but also in those things which regard the discipline and government of the church throughout the world. Very important. Notice that. Discipline and government. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But I also want to note in the next screen, there's an anathema attached to this. "If anyone then shall say that the Roman pontiff has the office merely of inspection or direction." That's important, because some people are going to say, look, all the Pope can do is he can just kind of inspect the liturgical situation and kind of direct it, but he can't make major changes to it. In fact, I'm going to quote somebody who's going to say that later on. I would say that goes against what Trent is saying here. He has more than just the authority to inspect and direct. So "if anyone then shall say that the Roman pontiff has the office merely of inspection or direction, and not the full and supreme power of jurisdiction over the universal church," not only in those things which belong to faith and morals, so not just in faith and morals, but also in those which relate to discipline and government of the church spread throughout the world, or assert that he possesses merely the principal part and not all the fullness of this supreme power, and that this power which he enjoys is not ordinary and immediate, but over each and all the churches and over each and all the pastors of the faithful, let him be anathema. There's an anathema attached to this. It's pretty serious stuff. I mean, look, if you're anathematized by the church, you're no longer in communion with it. So we definitely want to avoid this anathema. Now, whether or not the proposition that we're discussing, if a person denies it falls under that anathema, can be debated, but I do want to present that. All right, so Pius XII, Mediator Dei, says this: "It follows from this that the sovereign pontiff alone enjoys the right to recognize and establish any practice touching the worship of God. Notice it's the Pope who has that authority, not me as a private individual. It's the Pope who can recognize and establish any practice touching the worship of God, to introduce and approve new rites. So we even have an introduction and approving of new rites, new liturgical rites, as also to modify those he judges to require modification. So now we're not just talking about introducing a new rite, we're actually talking about modifying existing liturgical practices. And it's something that he judges requires modification, not what I think may or may not require modification. It's what the Pope thinks. Very important. Continuing with the magisterium, quo primum from Pius V says this: we specifically command each and every patriarch, administrator, and of all persons or whatever ecclesiastical dignity they may be they even cardinals of the Holy Roman Church, or possessed of any other rank or preeminence, and we order them in virtue of holy obedience to chant or to read mass according to the rite and manner and norm herewith laid down by us, and hereafter, notice this, to discontinue and completely discard all other rubrics and rites of other missals. So he is speaking about the discontinuation of other rites of other missals. The term rite, however, is being used a little bit different back then than we would use the term today. But liturgical practices, you could think of it like that. He has the authority to discontinue them. And notice he says, however ancient. So what he's speaking about here is not what he was speaking about elsewhere, where he was saying that what he's discontinuing are rites that are 200 years or less old, and one is allowed to still preserve those that are over 200 years old. Now he's talking about, in a specific context, discontinuing certain liturgical practices in certain locations, even though they may be ancient, which they have customarily followed, and they must not, in celebrating Mass, presume to introduce any ceremonies or recite any prayers other than those contained in this missal. And by the way, he did not believe that was definitive, because he himself made changes to that very missal, but just a few years later. All right, this one is from Pope Pius VI, Auctorem Fidei. He says the church, and by the way, this is a proposition that's being condemned by the Pope. The Pope is censoring this with the theological censor. He's censoring the person who says, well, the church, which is ruled by the Spirit of God, could have established discipline, which is not only useless and burdensome for the Christian liberty to endure, but which is even dangerous and harmful and leading to superstition and materialism. He condemns that as false, rash, scandalous, dangerous, offensive to pious ears, injurious to the church and to the Spirit of God, by whom it is guided, at least erroneous. He gives kind of a global censor there. Kind of interesting that he gives a global censor for one proposition. But be that as it may, notice what he's doing here. He's condemning the person who says that the church could establish disciplines that are dangerous and harmful, which I would say is behind some of the people who reject the position that I'm maintaining here. All right, moving on. Note this. This is just a brief note on liturgical discipline, because earlier we were talking about the magisterium and its ability to modify matters of discipline and government. Now, I want you to note that the liturgy falls under discipline. Now, the liturgy also has matters of faith and morals in them. There's certain aspects of the liturgy that you cannot alter. They are not just merely disciplinary, such as the substance of the sacrament, which we'll see later on. Those are not merely disciplinary. But then there are plenty of things that are liturgical that are disciplinary. And this is what the old school Catholic encyclopedia says under the article Ecclesiastical Discipline. Among the chief duties of a Christian, the worship of God must be assigned to a place apart. The rules to be observed in this worship, especially public worship, constitute liturgical discipline. This cannot be said to depend absolutely upon the church, as it derives the essential part of the holy sacrifice and the sacraments from Jesus Christ. And so what it's saying is, there are some things that are liturgical that derive from Christ himself. Those things can't be altered. However, for the greater part, the liturgical discipline has been regulated by the church. So the majority of things that are done liturgically are regulated by the church, and includes the rites of the holy sacrifice, the administration of the sacraments, and of other ceremonies. These liturgical aspects and liturgical disciplines are within the authority of the church to modify, be it a pope or an ecumenical council. All right, moving on here. Pope Paul VI, he says this, and this is in his address to a general audience discussing the liturgical reform and the new Missal. He says, effectively, that the new Mass, the Missal of 69, has no substantial changes to it. There's no substantial change between the Missal of 69 and 62. He says this, but keep this clearly in mind. Nothing has been changed of the substance of our traditional Mass. Perhaps some may allow themselves to be carried away by the impression made by some particular ceremony or another rubric, and thus think that they conceal some alteration or diminution of truths which were acquired by the Catholic faith forever and are sanctioned by it. They might come to believe that the equation between the law of prayer, lex orandi, and the law of faith, lex credendi, is compromised as a result. That sounds like some people today. It is not so, absolutely not, above all, because the rite and the relative rubric are not in themselves a dogmatic definition. What he's saying is there are certain aspects of the liturgy that are not part of a dogmatic definition. And by extension, they're also not divinely established. They are disciplinary forms imposed by the church, and it is within the authority of the church to modify those. But the big key here is to note, nothing has been changed in the substance of our traditional Mass. According to Paul VI, there has been no major change. But it's not just Paul VI. Let's look at Pope Benedict XVI on the Missal of 69. According to Pope Benedict XVI, the Missal of 69 and the Missal of 62 are not two different rites. He says this, it is not appropriate to speak of these two versions of the Roman Missal as if they were two rites. He says that's not appropriate. Rather, it is a matter of a twofold use of one and the same rite. So the Missal of 62 and the Missal of 69, these are not two different rites. They are part of the same one Roman rite. He goes on to say elsewhere that there's no contradiction between the Missal of 69 and the Missal of 62. And when he says this, he means no rupture. He says this, there's no contradiction between the two editions of the Roman Missal. In the history of the liturgy, there is growth and progress, but no rupture. He says there's no rupture here. So if you think that there's actually a rupture with the Missal of 69 itself, I'm not saying with the way that some rogue priest out there celebrates it. There might be some rupture there, practically. I've witnessed it for sure. But just objectively considered, done properly, like St. John Cantius Parish, there's no rupture there, according to Benedict XVI. So take his opinion for whatever it's worth. Moving on. The Missal of 69 and the Missal of 62 are two uses of the one Roman rite per Benedict. It's one Roman rite. There are two uses of that rite. They're not two different rites. He states, these two expressions of the church's lex orandi will in no way lead to a division in the church's lex credendi, for they are two usages of the Roman rite. So it is not at all proper to speak of the traditional Latin Mass and the Novus Ordo as two different rites. You're going against Pope Benedict when you do that. And that has not been reversed by Pope Francis. Now, the Missal of 69 was willingly received by the people of God. I want to note this because there are some people that think that the Pope just imposed this top down, although he has the authority to do it. That wasn't the case. Benedict XVI says this, in response to this desire, our predecessor, Pope Paul VI in 1970, approved for the Latin Church revised and in part renewed liturgical books translated into various languages throughout the world. These were willingly received by the bishops as well as by priests and the lay faithful. At least according to Pope Benedict, this was not imposed top down, contrary to the majority of the faithful throughout the world. So again, take his opinion for whatever it's worth. And again, that was from Summorum Pontificum. Now, Benedict also says this. He thinks that John Paul II granted people the faculty to celebrate the Missal of 62. This is important, because it means he recognizes John Paul II had the authority to determine to what extent the Missal of 62 may or may not be celebrated. And this is not even to mention the fact that Pope Benedict himself imposed certain restrictions and certain requirements in order to celebrate the Missal of 62. He says this, Pope John Paul II, concerned for the pastoral care through the special indult issued by the Congregation for the Divine Worship, granted the faculty of using the Roman Missal published in 1962 by Blessed John the 23rd. He granted the faculty for them to celebrate this Mass. According to Pope Benedict, it is up to the Pope to grant the faculty to do this, which means he has the authority to restrict it. If he has the authority to grant the faculty, he also has the authority to restrict its usage. And that would include restricting it to the point of discontinuing it altogether. So I would say in the mind of Benedict, he thinks that this is within the power. It's not ultra vires. This is within the power of the Pope. Now, that is not to say that he thinks that a Pope should do it. In fact, I think, in my opinion, Benedict the 16th thinks that a Pope should not entirely restrict the Missal of 62. But it's clear that he, at least in theory, thinks that he could, because he recognizes that John Paul II is the one who had to grant an indult for it. And if you can grant an indult, you can also restrict its usage. Now, again, for Benedict XVI, there were no conditions for when someone could celebrate there were conditions for when someone can celebrate the Missal. Let me actually move on to the next one here. Yeah, there were conditions for when someone could celebrate the Missal of 62. It was not something that anyone could just do at will. According to Benedict, you couldn't, after the new Missal came out in 69, you couldn't just celebrate the Missal of 62 at will. Not at all. He says this: the conditions for the use of this Missal laid down by the previous documents, Quator ab hic annos in Ecclesia Dei, are now replaced as follows. And he goes on to give his own restrictions on and conditions for when this can be celebrated. So he's noting that there were conditions before, and he's even mentioning some of his own conditions. He goes, now this is actually from John Paul II. And this is from that document that Benedict was just quoting from, Quator ab hic annos. Since, however, the same problem continues, the Supreme Pontiff, in a desire to meet the wishes of these groups, grants to diocesan bishops the possibility of using an indult, whereby priests and faithful, who shall be expressly indicated in the letter of request to be presented to their own bishop, may be able to celebrate the Mass using by Roman Missal according to 1962 edition, but under the following conditions. And he goes to give conditions. But you can't grant something that you don't think you have the authority to restrict. So please note that. All right, moving on. I want to briefly just mention here Suarez, well-known theologian, on the authority of the Pope in relation to the liturgy. And for those of y'all who would think, well, how long is this presentation going to be? We're about halfway done. Now, this is from, again, Suarez. He notes that the church can change accidental features of the liturgy, but not anything of the substance of the sacrament. This is, in fact, what the theologians are going to reiterate over and over and over. You can't change the substance of the sacraments. That's established divinely. Nobody has that power and authority. But there are some things that do not pertain to the substance of the sacrament that can be modified. And if that's true of the sacraments, that's also true of the liturgical rite in which that sacrament is found. Because, in fact, the Roman Rite and quite a few other rites, they were not, in an unqualified sense, just simply divinely established. And there was no Roman Rite in 90 AD, per se. Now, there were certain features and aspects of the Roman Rite as we have it in the Missal of 62 that could be found in the apostolic era. For sure, there's continuity there. But they were not celebrating an actual full-blown Roman Rite in the year 90 AD, for example. All right. Now, he goes on to say this. When the king, in his 4th article, accuses the Catholic Church of novelty in that it presents the Eucharist to the laity and the appearances of only bread, let me clarify. He's speaking about the king who is saying, the King of England, who is saying, the Catholic Church is wrong to restrict communion under one kind, under the appearances of bread only. Suarez says, he seems to be stuck in the same rut, for he relies on the fact that in its usage and rites, the church cannot add or subtract anything which, taken universally and without limitation, has been shown by us to be contrary to reason in Scripture. For although the church is not able to change things which are of the substance of the sacraments and were instituted by Christ, nevertheless, things which pertain to the accidentals of the rite, notice that, and to the manner of the users and are capable of variation and can be changed by the authority of the church according to the opportunity of the times. This is something that the church itself has the authority to do, either a pope or an ecumenical council. It can change accidental features of a sacrament and then by extension of the rite itself. It, however, cannot change the substance. Moving on. This is from Jungmann, a liturgical scholar. The change of custom, and this particular custom that he's referring to is communion of the hand versus communion on the tongue. He's saying prior to this, communion on the hand was predominant, and he gives a copious amount of primary sources substantiating that. And that's definitely the case. In fact, the Sixth Ecumenical Council mandates communion on the hand. All right, moving on. He says, the change of custom is contemporary with the transition from leavened to unleavened bread and is probably related to it. So he's saying this change from going from communion on the hand to communion on the tongue is contemporary with the change where the Roman, or the Western Church, I should say, goes from leavened to unleavened bread. And he says they're probably related to each other. He goes on, at the Synod of Rouen, which is around 878, a further rule was established that at high mass, the priest was to give the Eucharist into the hands of the deacon and subdeacon, no longer to the laity. During the 10th and 11th centuries, this rite was narrowed down to priests and deacons, and then it disappeared entirely. This was all sanctioned under Rome. And communion on the hand, this was something that was ancient, but I would grant not everything that's ancient is the best. In fact, I think that communion on the tongue is much more preferable to communion on the hand in today's context. I'm opposed to communion on the hand in the vast majority of parishes, not on a matter of principle, but on the matter of most people aren't doing it very well. They're leaving particles all over their hands. They fall on the floor. They're being disrespectful. They're treating it like it's a cracker. There's all kinds of problems with it. But just noting here that this happened under the auspices of Rome, this is a pretty big change. And then going on to one other one, communion under one kind is noted to be apostolic by the Council of Trent, and yet this is, of course, something that was modified by the authority of the Church. The Council of Trent states, wherefore, Holy Mother Church, knowing that this her authority in the administration of the sacraments, although the use of both species has from the very beginning, from the beginning of the Christian religion, not been unfrequent. So they're noting this has testimony going back all the way to the beginning. Yet in progress of time, that custom having been already widely changed, she induced by weighty and just reasons, has approved of this custom in communicating under one species and decreed that it would be held as a law, which is not lawful to reprobate or change at pleasure without the authority of the church itself. So we talk about preserving tradition, and all that sounds wonderful, except for the fact that there are traditions that Rome has not preserved. And again, as I noted previously, it's up to the church to determine which traditions it will preserve and which traditions are not going to be preserved. Moving on, Pope Paul VI, he revised, though I would say not substantially, both the matter and form of the sacrament of the anointing of the sick. He revised both. Now, again, it's important to maintain tradition, but I mean, are we going to say this was ultra vires? Are we going to say that, okay, now the administration of the sacrament under the Missal of 69 or after this change is no longer valid? I mean, to what extent are we going to carry this argument? Moving on to the next one. Pius XII spoke about the possibility of the church changing the matter of the sacrament of ordination to the priesthood in certain cases. In fact, some would argue that the Council of Florence spoke of the matter of the priesthood as one way, and then Pius XII proposed and reformed another way. Pius says this: if it was at one time necessary, even for validity by the will and command of the church, everyone knows that the church has the power to change and abrogate what she herself has established. So if she herself has established certain requirements for the validity of a sacrament, this is not if Christ has established them. But if she has established certain requirements for the validity of a sacrament, specifically the matter, then she has the authority to change that. That's according to Pius XII. Now, are there limits to papal authority? Absolutely. The Pope can't change the word of God. That's Dei Verbum 10. The Pope can't add new revelation to the word of God. Also Dei Verbum 10. The Pope's not able to change the substance of the sacraments, which were instituted by Christ Suarez. There are limits, clearly. But what I'm saying is, if they are below these restrictions, the church is able to make modifications. And again, it is up to, as we saw, the church to discern what to preserve and what not to preserve as far as ecclesiastical traditions and liturgical discipline. Now, Pope Paul VI says this. In fact, he backs up what I'm saying right here. This is a really interesting point. There are those who, under the pretext of a greater fidelity to the church and the magisterium, systematically refuse the teaching of the council itself. So there's people who reject Vatican II, its application and the reforms. So he's speaking about its application and the reform, and he's not just speaking about Sacrosanctum Concilium. This is after the Missal of Paul VI has been applied. So he's now speaking of the Missal itself, the Missal of 69. He says its application and the reforms that stem from it, its gradual application by the Apostolic See and the Episcopal conferences under our authority, willed by Christ. It is even affirmed that the Second Vatican Council is not binding, that the faith would be in danger also because of the post-conciliar reforms and guidelines, which there is a duty to disobey to preserve certain traditions. So in order to preserve certain traditions, some are saying there's a duty to disobey these liturgical reforms. He says, what traditions? Does it belong to this group and not the Pope, not the Episcopal College, not an ecumenical council to establish which of the countless traditions must be regarded as the norm of faith? I would say what we've heard is that, yes, we ought to guard and preserve traditions, and all that's true. But again, ultimately, it's up to the church to determine which ones it's going to preserve and which ones it is going to discontinue. And there are some that it has preserved, and there are some that it has discontinued. Now, this is from Pius XI, Casti Connubii, speaking about who has the authority to determine the answer to the question of, which traditions ought to be preserved and which ones ought to be discontinued, and what is the extent of papal authority? Who really has the authority to determine the answer to this question? Pius XI says this in Casti Connubii, wherefore, let the faithful also be on their guard against the overrated independence of private judgment. Now, that's not to say that we can't use private judgment at all. Sure, we can. But there is an extent where it becomes overrated and even against the church. And that false autonomy of human reason, for it is quite foreign to everyone bearing the name of a Christian to trust his own mental powers with such pride as to agree only with those things which he can examine from their inner nature, and to imagine that the church sent by God to teach and guide all nations is not conversant with present affairs and circumstances. And here it is. Or even that they must obey only in those matters which she has decreed by solemn definition, as though her other decisions might be presumed to be false, or putting forward insufficient motive for truth and honesty. Quite to the contrary, a characteristic of all true followers of Christ, lettered or unlettered, is to suffer themselves to be guided and led in all things that touch upon faith and morals by the Holy Church of God, through its supreme pastor, the Roman pontiff, who is himself guided by Jesus Christ our Lord. Now, he's talking here specifically about faith and morals and doctrine. And he's saying, look, those people who say that I don't have to obey this unless it's a solemn definition, they're wrong. That's wrong. You have to obey those things and assent to those things that are even lesser than a solemn definition. But if that pertains to matters of doctrine and faith and morals, it most certainly pertains to lesser matters such as discipline. Wrapping it up here, continuing with who has the authority to determine the answer. This is from Pope Nicholas. This is in the first millennium. He says, it is immediately clear that the judgments of the Apostolic See, than which there is no greater authority, can be handled by any other tribunal, nor is it permissible for any to sit in judgment upon its decisions. We do not have the permission or the authority or the ability to sit in judgment of officially promulgated decisions made by a pope and just flippantly say, I don't think this is in keeping with tradition. We don't have that authority. It's not permissible for anyone to sit in judgment upon its decision. Moving forward, I want to answer just a few brief objections, and then that will conclude the presentation here. Didn't Pope Benedict XVI say that that which was once sacred cannot be entirely forbidden? So in other words, I mean, how can you forbid the Missal of 62 and then just impose the Missal of 69 if that which was sacred, once sacred, cannot be entirely forbidden? Here's my response. Benedict says that was considered sacred before can't be all of a sudden entirely forbidden. That's quote, all of a sudden entirely forbidden. But this does not mean it can't be gradually discontinued. Now, we still need to recognize that it's sacred. I mean, we're not going to say that the Missal of 62 is no longer sacred if the Pope discontinues it. No, you still recognize that it's sacred. But what he's saying is it shouldn't be all of the sudden discontinued, which is why I think that Benedict does not think that a Pope should just immediately discontinue the Missal of 62. I don't think he's in favor of that. I think he recognizes the ability for the Pope to do it, but I don't think he agrees with it prudentially. He states, what earlier generations held as sacred remains sacred and great for us too, and it cannot be all of a sudden entirely forbidden or even considered harmful. And I agree with that, but I don't think that that's really relevant to whether or not the Pope can actually discontinue the Missal of 62 gradually. Now, there's another one here from Claus Gamber that was brought up. And Claus Gamber is, in fact, brought up often. And I remember reading through Gamber back in 2014, 2015. I loved his book, and I still find that there's a whole lot of good in it. But there are some things that I would disagree with in it. Now, the question or the objection is, doesn't Monsignor Claus Gamber argue that the Pope cannot aggregate the Missal of 62? In fact, he has a whole chapter dedicated to just that, part of which I think Timothy quoted from just a moment ago. Here's my response. Gamber seems to take a view that contradicts Pope Benedict XVI. So even though I know Ratzinger wrote a foreword to it, later Ratzinger, Benedict XVI, has a different view than Gamber. Because Gamber claims the Missal of 69 is a new rite. He explicitly says that. He also thinks that the Pope can't make major changes to the liturgy, which means for Gamber, the Missal of 62 is probably ultra vires. And I don't know if we would be willing to go that far here. But it seems to me like Gamber probably takes the view, I would think it logically follows from what he argues, which we're going to see here in a moment, that the Missal of 69 is ultra vires because there are some fairly major changes to it. Not substantial, but major enough.
Just so viewers know, can you just explain ultra vires?
Yeah, ultra vires. I mean, it's just a Latin term. Effectively, all it means is it's beyond his authority, right? So I think that Gamber's position would require, I don't know if he would be willing to admit it, but I think his position requires, based on what we're about to see, that the Missal of 69 and the liturgical reforms of Pope Paul VI are beyond the authority of Paul VI to implement. And in fact, that's a very popular view among some Catholics today. They'll actually say that the Missal of 69 was illegal, to use the phrase of some. Now, here's what Gamber states. And again, this goes contrary to what Benedict XVI is saying in Summorum Pontificum and the accompanying letter of Summorum Pontificum sent out to the bishops on the occasion of its promulgation. Gamber states this: since there's no document that specifically assigns to the Apostolic See the authority to change, let alone to abolish the traditional liturgical rite. Just stop there. That kind of reminds me of those people that says, well, you know, there's no one specific place, you know, prior to Humanae Vitae, if somebody were to say, oh, there's no one specific place that forbids this, or well, you know, there's also that which is called the Ordinary and Universal Magisterium, but I would disagree with him here, and I think he's setting it up in terms that shouldn't be established. But again, there's no document that specifically assigns to the Apostolic See the authority to change, let alone to abolish the traditional liturgical rite. He's speaking of the Missal of 62. And since furthermore, it can be shown that not a single predecessor of Paul VI has ever introduced major changes to the Roman liturgy, I beg to differ. The assertion that the Holy See has the authority to change the liturgical rite would appear to be debatable. I mean, he thinks debatable, to say the least. In other words, he thinks that he's against it, right? But he at least is willing to say that it is debatable. He's not going to say that his position is definitive, but he definitely isn't in favor of those who would say that the Missal of 62 could be discontinued. At the same time, we can say that there is no question that the Holy See does have authority to approve and oversee publications of liturgical books, and more generally, to approve and oversee liturgical traditions. Now, earlier we saw the magisterium, it says he has more than that authority of just merely inspecting and directing. He has more than that authority. He has the authority to change liturgical disciplinary aspects to the extent that he sees fit. And it's, again, not just the Pope, it's also an ecumenical council that has that same authority. Now, he continues in the footnote to that part of the book, which was page 39 of the book, The Reform of the Roman Liturgy, Its Problems and Background. He says in the footnote this: the following point is worth pondering, as already discussed according to canon law. A person's affiliation with a particular liturgical rite is determined by that person's rite of baptism. Given that the liturgical reforms of Paul VI created a de facto new rite, and I don't think it saves him that he says de facto instead of de jure. He's saying this is a new rite, the Missal of 69. That's completely against what Benedict himself said. So anybody who's trying to use Gamber and Ratzinger in conjunction, it's not going to work. One can assert that those among the faithful who were baptized according to the traditional Roman rite have the right to continue following that rite, just as a priest who were ordained according to the traditional ordo have the right to exercise their very right that they were ordained to celebrate. So what he's saying is people who are baptized under the Missal of 62, they have a right to continue that and not have to be under the Missal of 69, because the Missal of 62 and Missal of 69 are two different rites, and there's a canonical requirement. Well, there's a canonical privilege for somebody who, if you're baptized under one rite, you're allowed to continue in that rite. Again, that assumes, and also he proposes, that the Missal 62 and 69 are two different missals. And if they're not, his argument fails. And according to Benedict, they're not. So, last one here. Then Cardinal Ratzinger, in the spirit of the liturgy, say there are limits to papal power of the liturgy. So here's the quote, as far as my response. After the Second Vatican Council, the impression arose that the Pope really could do anything in liturgical matters, especially if he were acting on the mandate of an ecumenical council. Eventually, the idea of the givenness of the liturgy, the fact that one cannot do with it what one will, faded from the public consciousness of the West. In fact, the First Vatican Council had in no way defined that the Pope was an absolute monarch. On the contrary, it presented him as the guarantor of obedience to the revealed word. But I would simply say changing from the Missal of 62 to 69 is not going against the revealed word. The Pope's authority is bound to the tradition of faith. Now, this is speaking of apostolic and especially divine apostolic tradition. It can't be referring to even human apostolic tradition, because the church has itself changed certain human apostolic traditions. So he's clearly referring, when he speaks of this, to divine tradition. And that also applies to the liturgy. So in other words, those parts of the liturgy that pertain to divine tradition, yeah, the church can't change that. And anybody who thinks that Vatican I grants that, they're wrong. It is not manufactured by the authorities. Even the Pope can only be a humble servant of its lawful development in a binding integrity and identity. The authority of the Pope is not unlimited. It is at the service of sacred tradition. We're not talking about ecclesiastical traditions, not in the sense that we're using that term today. Now, we could try to equivocate with how that may have been used in the first millennium, but they're not using those terms in the same way as we are. This is specifically sacred tradition that the Pope is not above, that he is speaking about in the spirit of the liturgy. So my conclusion on that is the Missal of 69 does guard the revealed word and serves sacred tradition. So if one were to fail to do so, if Paul VI failed to guard the revealed word and sacred tradition, what was Pope Benedict doing when he celebrated this thing as Pope? I mean, is he failing to guard sacred tradition by celebrating the Missal of 69? I mean, the Reformed liturgy? Clearly, that's not the case. And then one more. Didn't Pope Benedict say that the Missal of 62 was never abrogated? Well, according to Benedict XVI, the Missal of 69 was never abrogated, but this does not mean it could not be restricted. He says this: as for the use of the Missal of the 1962 Missal as forma extraordinaria of the liturgy of the Mass, I would like to draw attention to the fact that this Missal was never juridically abrogated, and consequently, in principle, was always permitted. Here's the part that people miss, though. At the time of the introduction of the new Missal, it did not seem necessary to issue specific norms for the possible use of the earlier Missal. Why would he say that, if it weren't the case that he thinks that there could be norms to restrict the use of the Missal? Clearly, he thinks that John Paul II could restrict the use of the Missal of 62. He spoke about that, as we saw earlier. He himself imposes certain conditions for the celebration of the Missal of 62. So he believes there are certain norms that the church can grant or revoke in order to celebrate this Missal. So this quote that everybody always goes to, it was never juridically abrogated, that might be true, but that does not mean that the Pope couldn't discontinue it, because he goes on to say that, the Pope had to issue an indult to allow for its celebration. Well, if he issues an indult, he can also restrict it. And then didn't the Pope have to take a papal oath promising to uphold tradition? Some have pointed to various papal oaths that were taken by popes that speak about preserving liturgical tradition. Here's my response. Various papal oaths were taken at certain periods in church history, and some of them speak of the duty to preserve the liturgical discipline of the church. And I wholeheartedly affirm there's a general duty of the church, the Pope, to do that. He shouldn't just flippantly change whatever he wants. This is clearly to be understood as a general rule. It's a moral rule. It's not a juridical rule. Not as a strict obligation, as numerous popes have modified liturgical discipline over the centuries. Also, if this were to be understood as a strict rule, something juridical, then the Pope could not have unilaterally modified the creed without the filioque. Every Eastern Orthodox worth their salt will note that that is exactly what we did in the West. I affirm the Pope's authority to do that. I'm right there with Aquinas, who says that the Pope can draw up a new symbol, which is a new creed. I'm right there with Aquinas. I'm right there with the Pope. I stand with them when it comes to the creed. I believe the Pope has that authority, but let's not kid ourselves. He did that unilaterally. So, final slide here to summarize. There's certain limits to papal authority over the liturgy. We saw them, but the Pope also has authority to change accidental features to the liturgy. He cannot change, however, the substantial aspects to the sacraments. The Missal of 62 is the same rite as the Missal of 69. So if he were to somehow, say, okay, well, we're not going to have any more celebration of the Missal of 69. If he were to discontinue it, the Roman Rite's still preserved in the Missal of 69. He didn't eliminate a rite. And then the Missal of 62 and 69 do not differ substantially. That was what we saw from Paul VI and also from Benedict XVI. The Pope has the authority to discontinue the Missal of 62 in favor of the Missal of 69, per the disciplinary changes that we saw the magisterium says that the Pope is able to alter.
Oh wait, before you go, I would really appreciate it if you would consider supporting this channel. This is my primary means to provide for my family, and it also helps me to produce content like this video. If you would like to support me, become a patron by visiting patreon.com/reason and theology. You'll also get access to extra exclusive content when you become a patron. Lastly, hit that like button and the subscribe button, and be sure to leave a comment down below. God bless.